The cruiser rolled up slow, lights flashing on a quiet street where an old man rocked on his porch. "You gotta leave, old man. This house isn't yours anymore." He didn't move, just nodded to the papers in his trembling hand. What the young cop read next would shake an entire neighborhood awake. This is Hopeful Horizon. Before we begin, drop a comment with where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for real stories that remind us where we come from. Officer Marcus Jenkins stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt with the confidence of someone who'd been on the force for exactly 8 months. The radio crackled with dispatch chatter as he approached the small house at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story home that looked tired compared to the gleaming new developments that had sprouted around it like concrete mushrooms. The neighborhood was a study in contrasts. To the left stood a row of identical townhomes with manicured lawns and Tesla charging stations. To the right, a luxury apartment complex advertised "Urban Living Redefined" on a banner that fluttered in the afternoon breeze. But here, at 1247 Maple Street, sat a house that time seemed to have forgotten. The white paint was peeling in places, the front steps showed wear from decades of use, and the garden was overgrown with wildflowers that some might call weeds. But the porch was swept clean, and an elderly black man sat in a wooden rocking chair, a manila folder resting in his lap. "Afternoon, sir," Officer Jenkins called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd been taught to project. "I'm Officer Jenkins. I need to speak with you about this property." The man looked up slowly, his weathered face calm despite the flashing lights. He was perhaps in his 80s, wearing a carefully pressed button-down shirt and suspenders that had seen better decades. His eyes held the kind of patience that comes from surviving more storms than most people could imagine. "Good afternoon, officer," he replied, his voice steady and dignified. "I'm Samuel Lewis. What seems to be the trouble?" Jenkins pulled out a folded set of papers from his shirt pocket. "Mr. Lewis, I have an eviction notice here. The property management company says you're trespassing on private property. I'm going to need you to gather your things and vacate the premises." Mr. Lewis didn't move from his chair. He simply looked at the young officer with something that might have been pity. "Officer Jenkins, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This house, I built it myself, with these hands." He held up his palms, still calloused despite his age. "I've been living here since 1964. Jenkins let out a short laugh, the kind that comes from someone who thinks they've heard every sob story in the book. "Sir, I understand you might be confused, but the paperwork is clear. This property was foreclosed on 6 months ago. The new owners want you out. Now, I can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, you're leaving today." The old man's fingers tightened slightly on the folder in his lap, but his expression remained peaceful. "Son, I'm not confused, and I'm not leaving. This is my home." The confrontation was drawing attention. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson peered through her blinds before quickly looking away. Next door, a young couple who'd moved in last month stood on their balcony, phones in hand, but neither moved to intervene. The unspoken rule of the neighborhood seemed to be, mind your own business, especially when the police were involved. Officer Jenkins felt his patience wearing thin. He'd been told this would be a simple eviction. Go in, remove the trespasser, secure the property. Nobody had mentioned the old man would be stubborn. "Mr. Lewis, I'm trying to be respectful here, but you're not giving me much choice." Jenkins reached for his radio. "I'm going to call for backup if you don't cooperate, and if you resist, I'll have to place you under arrest for trespassing." The threat hung in the air like summer heat. Mr. Lewis continued rocking slowly, his eyes never leaving the young officer's face. "You know, Officer Jenkins, I've seen a lot of young men like you come through this neighborhood over the years, full of authority, sure they know what's right and what's wrong." He paused, looking down at the folder in his lap. "But authority without understanding is just noise. Sir, I don't need a lecture. I need you to stand up and walk away from this property." Jenkins' voice was getting louder, his hand resting on his radio. "You're trespassing on private property, and if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll be forced to arrest you." Mr. Lewis sighed deeply, the sound of someone who'd fought too many battles to be intimidated by one more. "This is my property, son. Has been for 60 years. I paid for every nail, every board, every shingle on this roof. I planted that oak tree when it was just a sapling." He pointed to the massive tree that shaded half the front yard. "I buried my wife's cat under that rose bush. I raised my children on this porch." "The paperwork says otherwise," Jenkins insisted, waving the eviction notice, "and paperwork doesn't lie." Mr. Lewis looked at him with something approaching sadness. "No, son, but sometimes it doesn't tell the whole truth either." The standoff stretched on for several minutes, the old man refusing to budge and the young officer growing more frustrated by the moment. Finally, Mr. Lewis shifted forward in his chair and held out the manila folder. "Officer Jenkins, before you call your backup, before you put handcuffs on an old man for sitting on his own porch, I want you to read something. Every line, every word." Jenkins hesitated. Part of him wanted to call for backup immediately, to end this situation before it got more complicated. But something in the old man's tone made him pause. There was no desperation there, no pleading, just quiet confidence. "What is it?" Jenkins asked, taking the folder but not opening it. "The truth," Mr. Lewis replied simply. Jenkins opened the folder and began to scan the contents. At first glance, it looked like any collection of old documents, yellowed papers, faded signatures, the kind of stuff people keep in attics. But as he read more carefully, his expression began to change. The first document was a deed, dated August 15th, 1964. Property located at 1247 Maple Street, purchased by Samuel Lewis and his wife, Dorothy Lewis. The signature was bold and clear, even after 6 decades. But it was the second document that made Jenkins slow down. It was a city planning document from 1967, showing the donation of 2 acres of land by Samuel Lewis for the construction of Lewis Park, the same park where Jenkins had played basketball as a teenager just 3 blocks away. The third document was a letter from the school board, dated 1973, thanking Samuel Lewis for his donation of land for the construction of Maple Street Elementary School. The same school Jenkins had attended. There were photographs too. A much younger Samuel Lewis, hammer in hand, working alongside other men to frame a house. The same house they were now sitting in front of. Another photo showed the Lewis family at a neighborhood barbecue. Dozens of people gathered in what was now the park, children playing under the same oak tree that currently shaded the porch. Jenkins looked up from the papers, his face pale. "Mr. Lewis, I don't understand. If you own this house, if you donated the land for the park and the school, then how did someone try to evict me from my own home?" Mr. Lewis finished gently. "That's a good question, son. One I've been asking myself for months." As Jenkins continued reading through the documents, a story began to emerge that no one had told him about this neighborhood. Samuel Lewis wasn't just a homeowner, he was a founding father of the community. The documents painted a picture of a young man who'd arrived in the area in 1964 with his new wife when Maple Street was nothing but farmland and dreams. Samuel had worked construction during the day and built his own house at night, board by board, with help from other families who were also trying to establish roots in what was then considered the outskirts of town. But Samuel hadn't stopped with just building his own home. When the city proposed turning the area into industrial warehouses, he'd rallied the neighbors to fight for residential zoning. When the community needed a place for children to play, he donated part of his land for the park. When the school districts said they couldn't afford to build in the area, he donated more land and helped organize fundraisers. The photographs showed the evolution of the neighborhood through the decades. Samuel and Dorothy Lewis at community meetings, organizing block parties, planting trees, painting houses for elderly neighbors. Their own children playing in the park that Samuel had donated, graduating from the school he'd helped build. "I was here when this was just dirt roads and big dreams," Mr. Lewis said softly, watching Jenkins read. "I helped build the sewer system, organized the first neighborhood watch, convinced the city to put in streetlights. This wasn't just where I lived, it was what I built." Jenkins looked around the street with new eyes. The mature trees that lined the sidewalks, the way the houses were positioned to create natural community spaces, the park visible at the end of the street. It all suddenly made sense. This wasn't just random suburban development. It was a planned community, and Samuel Lewis had been the planner. "But if you donated so much land, if you were so involved in building this place, why would anyone try to evict you?" Jenkins asked. Mr. Lewis's expression hardened slightly. Because some people see an old black man in a house that's worth more than they think he could afford, and they assume he doesn't belong. Jenkins reached for his radio, but this time it wasn't to call for backup to arrest Mr. Lewis. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need to speak with Detective Morrison about the eviction order for 1247 Maple Street. There may be irregularities with the paperwork. As he waited for the callback, more neighbors began to emerge from their houses. Word was spreading through the community that something was happening at Mr. Lewis's house, and people were curious. Some of the older residents recognized the documents Jenkins was holding and began sharing their own stories about Samuel Lewis's contributions to the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen from across the street brought over a photo from the 1980s showing Samuel helping to organize a street festival. The Martinez family from 2 houses down had a thank you card Samuel had written when he'd helped them navigate the city bureaucracy to get their driveway repaved. When Detective Morrison called back, the conversation was brief, but revealing. The eviction order had been filed by Meridian Property Development, a company that had been buying up older homes in the neighborhood for demolition and redevelopment. But when Morrison ran the paperwork through the county records, irregularities became apparent immediately. Jenkins, Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. The foreclosure papers are fraudulent. The property was never in default, and the mortgage was paid off in 1987. Someone at Meridian forged the documents. The revelation sent a ripple through the growing crowd of neighbors. Samuel Lewis sat quietly in his rocking chair, vindicated but not surprised. He'd known the truth all along. Within an hour, Detective Morrison arrived with a warrant for the arrest of Meridian's CEO, David Brennan. The investigation would eventually reveal that Brennan had been using forged documents to fraudulently evict longtime residents, particularly elderly homeowners who might not have the resources to fight back legally. As the news spread through the neighborhood, the crowd around Samuel Lewis's house grew. Children from the school he'd helped build came to see what was happening. Teenagers from the park he'd donated stopped their basketball games to listen to the story. Adults who'd never known the history of their own neighborhood began to understand the foundation they'd been living on. "I never knew," said Jennifer Walsh, who'd moved to the street 5 years earlier. "I had no idea that Mr. Lewis was the reason we have the park, the school, any of this." Samuel Lewis smiled for the first time that day. "That's all right, dear. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because this is home." He didn't just own a house. He owned every nail that held this street together. And when they tried to erase him, a single sheet of paper reminded everyone whose name built their home. If this story moved you, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe to Hopeful Horizon for true stories that remind us we stand on foundations laid by those we can't afford to forget. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay grateful, and remember, real ownership is bigger than a signature. This is Hopeful Horizon signing off.